Right after I released Lightroom Classic benchmark running on different M1 processor, Capture One has announced that they have a version of their software that will run natively on Apple Silicon. So the best thing to do is to benchmark and see how does it perform against some of the M1 Macs, and also how does it compare to the Intel counterpart. Let's find out. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. This video will focus on Capture One and how does it perform on different M1 processor, comparing it to the Intel counterpart. I've tested two versions, Capture One 20 and 21. 21 is the version that runs natively on the Apple M1 Silicon. So when you optimize something for the code base of a silicon that you're running and you're no longer translating the code using Rosetta 2, you will see some performance improvement. And that is something that we expect. So let's see how does it perform on these computers. Now, before we do that, we need to talk about the test system that I have, and these are the systems that I own, and if you've been following my videos, you have seen this before. So I have the 12-core Mac Pro, 96 gigabytes of memory with the Radeon Pro video card. Then I also have a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro that has an 8-core, 32 gigabytes of memory, and it has the Radeon Pro 5500M with 8 gigabytes of onboard memory for the video card. Then we look at the M1 computers that we have, and there's three of them. So I have the Mac Mini M1, that's the 8-core 8 GPU, upgraded 16 gigabytes of memory, and the M1 MacBook Air, that is the 8-core 7 GPU with 8 gigabytes of unified memory and obviously 7-core GPU, as I mentioned already. And the last one is the iMac here, the purple one, which I really like. It looks really great, but again, machine that's not really in my demographic. I'm looking for something with more power. But anyhow, it has 8-core 8 GPU and 16 gigabytes of unified memory. So there we have it, the machine that we're going to use to run the testing here. So let's have a look at the benchmark. As I mentioned already, I already run the benchmark on Lightroom Classic. So if you want to see the result there, you can check the video up here and also in the link below. And also when you check out that video, Lightroom Cloud version performs very similarly to Lightroom Classic for the most part. So I didn't really put the result out there in a separate slide. Let's have a look at how Capture One performs. Starting with importing. When files are imported into Capture One and previews are rendered, you set the size for the preview in Capture One Preferences. And Capture One, even though it uses the GPU very intensively throughout the program, for example, when you're processing your files or when you're exporting, during the import process, it uses the CPU and barely touches the GPU for any type of rendering, which I find very interesting. And also, rather than using just 100 files to do an import and export, I've put the program and all these computers that I'm testing through a marathon with 1000 Nikon D850 45 megapixel file. What I really want to do is see how the computer performs and how the program run on these computers during this duration, rather than just doing this short burst where the processor can really ramp up to that speed and then it just cuts it down. It doesn't have to worry about heat. I want to see if there's any slowdown in the long term. So this is a really good test for that. And the size of my preview that I've chosen is 5120 pixels, which is pretty much the max that Capture One will do. So as we look through the charts, you're going to see that shorter is better. That's number one. Secondly, I've done tested on some of the machines. I've tested both version 20 and 21, so you can see that there. And when it comes to the M1 processor, I also listed whether it's running on Rosetta 2 or running native on the M1 processor. So let's start out by looking at the Mac Pro performance. This is a Mac Pro 2019 with 12-core processor. On version 20, it actually performs faster than version 21. So something happened there where they updated this version and the code is no longer really optimized to run well on the Intel computer. When it comes to the MacBook Pro running on the Intel processor, I just pretty much skipped version 20 and just tested version 21 just to give us an idea how does it perform against the Mac Pro, because that really gives us a pretty good perspective by just looking at the numbers here. And what we can see there is that this version nudged really close. It took about a minute longer, or actually about 30 seconds longer than the Mac Pro, which I find very interesting there. So as I mentioned, the code is not optimized somehow. And then once we start to look at the M1 processor, there are obviously some information missing, as you see there. For example, on the iMac, I didn't test version 20, but let's have a look at the Mac Mini results. So for version 20 running on Rosetta 2, it took about 40 minutes, close to 40 minutes to finish. On version 21, that number got reduced by about 5 minutes or so. what does this really tell us? It's just telling us that, yeah, we have a software that's now running optimized on the M1, but this optimization result in about a 5-minute improvement on 1,000 files. So it's not quite the big leap that we were hoping for, that I was hoping to see. And just one more thing I want to say, that I'm doing these benchmark import export performance because this is a really quantitative approach to all these numbers, and that's the one thing that I can do. Because I mean, let me put it this way. How does it perform on the M1 when you're trying to do edits and everything? It's fairly smooth for the most part. You're not going to run into any issues. But when we do this, we're going to start to see the performance of the machine and also how these programs run on these machines in the long run. And that's the reason why I'm doing these tests. All right. So if we take a look at all those native there, C21 native on the Mac Mini, on the iMac, and on the MacBook Air, pretty much those perform the same. That's because it has the same 8-core CPU for efficiency, for high performance. And it has pretty much all the same on all these 3 Macs that I have behind me that are running on the M1 processor. That's why we're not really seeing a big number of differences there. What I do find interesting is that on the MacBook Air running on Rosetta 2, it took about 42 minutes to render the preview, close to 43 minutes. So, I mean, it does take long, but obviously the program is not optimized to run on that code base. And one thing too that I want to mention, a lot of things have happened in this time frame. So some of the programs, or the last thing that I want to point out is that the MacBook Air, when you're running on Rosetta 2, took close to 43 minutes to render all these previews, which is a touch longer than the Mac Mini running on Rosetta 2. So it's not really quite difference there, but it is the longest one in this chart. So rather than looking at that, let's have a look at this one instead. Let's have a look at the Capture 21, just the import performance on all these machines. We can see right now that once we take out version 20, these are all running native on their respective processor. We can see that the M1 processor with Capture One is now beating out the Intel processor and even a high-end Intel Xenon processor. But here's the thing though, those Xenon processors are never really known for single core or 2-core performance. They're known when you try to bundle everything into a group, into a big batch performance. That's where the Xenon really takes off. So that's just something interesting there to look at the numbers. Okay, let's shift gear and look at the export performance for Capture One. When I ran this test, a few things that I found out is that sometimes when you launch Capture One or when you install an update, it may not optimize itself to the machine, meaning that it didn't run the hardware acceleration test before. And if it didn't do that, it's just using the CPU for export, which means the process will be very slow. So again, using the same 1000 Nikon D850 files, this is exporting it to JPEG 100%. Again, shorter is better for this. So you will see all the charts there that list all the machines with all the different GPU and also CPU exports. So if you take a look at Capture 120, when we use the GPU export, it took 24 minutes. When it's just using the CPU, when the machine or the software wasn't really optimized to run on that machine, it took 44 minutes to export all these 1000 files. Now, what's really interesting here is that Capture 121, running on the Mac Pro, using this GPU export, took 16 minutes. It's pretty much almost a 9-minute improvement over version 20. What's happening there? In my observation, I found out that version 21 utilizes more of the GPU performance, meaning that when it's running, the GPU chart peaks much higher than version 20. So they obviously have tuned that and increased the performance or increased the allocation that the program can use to process those files, which I find very interesting. And on version 21, if we just use the GPU core, it pretty much is the same. Version 20, I didn't even test it on my MacBook Pro because version 21 already tells us how that graphic card is performing. And for the rest of these, we are using GPU for export. And I did verify this using Activity Monitor. So Capture 121 on MacBook Pro 2019 with the Radeon 5500M with 8 GB of memory took 2 hours and 33 minutes. That is just absolutely sad. This is pretty much just showing us right here that the M1 processor are already pretty much nudging that GPU out already. So if we go down that list, we can see that the Mac Mini M1 running on Rosetta took about 1 hour and 5 minutes. This is also using the GPU export. But when it runs native, it takes around 51 minutes. So you have about a 15-minute improvement there on the time. So again, we start to see that the native version is running better, but we're not really getting that 50% improvement that we were really expecting to see. And this is something that I said in the very early part of my M1 review, that we're going to see improvement in the performance when you have all these software running natively, but I don't think that we're going to see a 2 times performance. I think we're going to see, for example, a 1.5 or something less than that performance increase, and that's pretty much reflecting what we're really seeing now. For the iMac, I just run the native version, and pretty much if you look at all of the M1 processor right now running native, the time are pretty much within line of each other. Even the MacBook Air, which has 8 core, 7 GPU, and also 8 gigabytes of memory. So even the base MacBook Air is doing a pretty good job exporting these. I mean, the machine does get hot, and the one thing I'll tell you right now is that the MacBook Pro 2019 running on the Intel processor, the fan just pretty much kicked on pretty much right away and ran through that whole 2 hours and 33 minutes. On all these M1 computers, the great thing about it is that the fan was pretty much silenced. Beside the Mac Mini, the fan did kick up a little bit, but it's really hard to see because, Mac Mini has a lot of cavity, a lot of heat dissipation anyway. On the iMac, the fan didn't really kick on that much at all. I mean, you do feel the fan running. For example, if you put your hand under the screen, you can feel that there is some hot air pushing out, but it didn't really quite kick on as hard as the 2019 MacBook Pro, which is about to take off from a runway, which I find interesting. Let's simplify this chart and look at version 21 numbers only. We can see that Mac Pro with a very powerful video card is still doing the best job there. Remind you that I have the Radeon Pro 2 with 32 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory. This is a very expensive card, and many of you are not getting these cards inside your Mac Pro. If you're just getting the Radeon 580X, the performance will probably be much slower than this, and that's just something to keep in mind there. If you're using Mac Pro just the CPU only, it comes in second at 44 minutes, and let's not even talk about the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro because that is just a really sad chart there. We can see though that on the M1 processor, for the most part, they perform very similarly the same, and that's because the number of GPU cores for the most part is very similar to each other. With the exception that MacBook Air having 1 less GPU core, that took about 2 minutes longer to export. That's pretty much it. This is telling us right now that these performance for the GPU on the M1 processor is getting there, where it's kicking the Intel butt and is also kicking many of the Radeon, especially inside the portable computer ones. Now here's the thing, when Apple released their own processor, when Apple released more GPU cores inside the processor, that's going to be very exciting. So what's going to come next with Apple Silicon, I think, is going to be really mind-blown with regards to performance, because right now what we're seeing is just iterative improvement for all these machines, but M1 is really starting to show us what these computers and these processors can really do. Now let's have a look at a preview comparison. So these are previews comparing Lightroom Classic and Capture One. For Lightroom Classic, I've set this to 1:1 using the same 1000 files, 45 megapixel Nikon D850, and in Capture One, I've set this to 5120 preview size. We can see the number there, and overall, what we can gather from here is that Lightroom does a much faster job rendering all these previews, getting you ready to go with your program when you're editing right away. But when it comes to these image editing programs, it's not so much which one is necessarily faster, although that is part of the equation. It's also what do you prefer and what does your workflow entail. For example, Capture One try to do all these catalog things, but Capture One, to me, I come from the phase 1 days where we're shooting medium format back, and Capture One is a program that's designed to mate with phase 1 back so that when you're capturing the session, you can see the Tether Capture Live preview right away. And this is before Lightroom and anything was around, by the way, so I've done this for quite some time. But when we take a look at Capture One now, I don't think if you're dealing with volume images, if you are a wedding, if you're an event shooter, I don't think that Capture One is necessarily the program that will accelerate your workflow quite as much as what Lightroom Classic can do at the moment. But that's just my personal assessment there. So we can see that Mac Pro is still, again, the best performing machine, but also one thing that I want to point out with this too is that Lightroom Classic is very memory hungry. So you can see there that machine that has more memory tends to do better, and it's almost regardless of the CPU performance. I mean, the CPU performance does make a difference. That's why the Mac Pro does better. But if you can see there, Mac Pro has 96 gigabytes of memory. That time really significantly reduced compared to anything else. And when we get to the MacBook Air M1 with only 8 gigabytes of memory, that took 42 minutes. That took about 12 minutes longer than the 16 gigabyte M1 computers. So if you're running Lightroom Classic and you're using Adobe product, just go for 16 gigabytes of memory. That is going to help out a lot. And if we take a look at Capture One, well, the preview doesn't really matter because it's just using the CPU on import, and pretty much it's head-to-head with all the Intel machines at this point. Granted, the M1 computers cost way less than all those Intel machines that I have listed here, so interesting note there. And lastly, let's look at the export comparison between Lightroom Classic and Capture One. These two programs export files and utilizes a different component inside your machine differently. Lightroom Classic will push the CPU and also memory hard, whereas Capture One will pushes the GPU core really hard. So you can see there that there are some numbers differences between the two. Lightroom Classic still a much faster program for exporting. With Lightroom Classic, I also listed a video card there, but for this chart, it really doesn't matter for Lightroom Classic as much. What really matters more here is the amount of memory that you have on the system. And you can kind of see there from the list that the shortest graph at the very top for the Mac Pro has the most memory. And as we go down, we start to have less memory, and that starts to take more time. With regards to Capture One, pretty much you have the most powerful video card at the top, and everything else just kind of falls into place as you see there, with the M1 performing pretty much just about the same to all of each other. So having the 8 or 7 core GPU on the M1 for Capture One doesn't really matter much. Okay, so here's my final thoughts on all this. Capture One running natively on the M1 processor, big yay. Seeing the performance improvement on these M1 processor when the process is now native, meh. I really like to see a larger performance sleeve, but I don't think we're really going to get that because running Capture One on both Rosetta 2 and on the native M1 process, the program is already maxing out the M1 GPU cores. It's just that on the native process is really understanding how to interpolate that code better and is directly talking to the chip itself rather than going through the Rosetta 2 translation layer. The only thing that I probably see where Capture One can really go in and improve it, the program, is to speed up the preview process. And in my head, I was thinking, well, they should have really used the GPU to render all those previews, but then just for a second there, logic kicks in and it makes sense that they don't really do it that way, because if you import the pictures in and you want to start the adjustment right away, all the adjustment in Capture One utilizes GPU quite a bit. So this way, if they don't use the GPU to render the preview, you have the resource ready for you immediately. So when you want to start edit, boom, you can go it like that and it's really fast. This is something different than in Lightroom Classic, for instance, where it just lock up your system because all the CPU cores are being used to process all these previews. So that's one big difference between these two programs. But if you look at the numbers there, one of the things I can tell you right now is that if you're working on batches or a large group of images, if you photograph weddings or events, Lightroom Classic is probably the better program to be using right now because there are advantages in speed when you're dealing with a large quantity of images. Now, I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other. Obviously, these two, as I mentioned before, are for two different type of workflows, and you really gotta define what works best for you. But this gives us a really great number we can think about. The test system that I have, I want to mention a little bit more about that. I have the Mac Pro with a really powerful video card. I know that very few of us have that system. Many of us will probably have the 27-inch iMac running on Intel Core i7 or Core i9. If you have got those machines within the past 2 or 3 years or so, those machines will probably hold on to its own pretty much well against these M1 processors for the time being. Let's wait until Apple release a more pro version of their processor with more GPU core, with more high performance core, and that time it will be much more compelling to jump into all these Apple Silicon process, because this is just more of a preview. This is giving us a glimpse of what the M1, what Apple Silicon can do, but it's not really showing us the full performance of what Apple has yet to unleash yet. So I would still recommend holding off for that. And one more thing I want to add is that I haven't yet done a test for Photoshop. I know that Photoshop is running natively on the M1 already, so we're going to compare Photoshop natively on these M1 machines against the Intel computer, and that video is definitely upcoming, so make sure you stay tuned for that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe if you're new, hit on the bell to be notified, and until next time, in art we trust.